Jimmy sat at his desk, his eyes fixed on the clock ticking away the minutes until the board meeting. 3 weeks had passed since his brother's tragic death, and the grief still felt like a fresh wound. He was torn between honoring his brother's legacy and doubting his own ability to fill the void. "Jessica, do you think I'm doing the right thing?" Jimmy asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. "I don't know if I can ever be what my brother was to this company." Jessica placed a reassuring hand on Jimmy's, her eyes locking onto his. "Jimmy, look at me. It's going to be fine. You're thinking too much. You're good enough." She reminded him of his passion for biotech and helping others, which had driven him since college. Her words sparked a glimmer of courage within Jimmy. "Thanks, Jessica," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Jessica smiled, her presence a steady source of comfort. She had been by Jimmy's side throughout the tragedy, refusing to take advantage of his vulnerability for personal gain. She knew Jimmy's fragile family history, losing parents at an early age and a brother who had been his rock. With his brother gone, Jimmy needed her now more than ever. As they headed to the board meeting, Jessica's support helped Jimmy's confidence. He knew he had a long road ahead, but with her by his side, he felt a sense of determination he hadn't felt in weeks. Jessica's mind wandered back to her college days, a time when Jimmy had saved her from the darkest corners of her own mind. They had been inseparable, a couple that had almost become one entity. Jessica had finally found comfort in her womanhood, but only when she was not in the college. Otherwise, Aaron, her male alter ego, would take over. Their love had been a thrilling adventure, filled with sneaky nights and stolen glances. But it wasn't without its mishaps. Like the time they were caught by their hostel mates, who thought Jimmy was sneaking in a mysterious girl from the girls' hostel. Or the night their lovemaking became so intense that Jessica's moans echoed through the corridors, prompting a concerned knock on the door. As Jessica explored her newfound womanhood, she started making friends with a group of girls who invited her for sleepovers. That night was fun for Jessica, gossiping and giggling with her new friends. But little did she know, disaster struck when the Elysium's effect wore off, and Jessica's male form began to emerge. Jessica panicked, and excused herself quickly to bathroom, her voice shaking inside as she texted Jimmy repeatedly. "Help. I'm turning into Guy," she typed, her thumbs flying across the screen. Jimmy, oblivious to the chaos, replied with a calm "What's wrong, babe?" Jessica's responses became increasingly frantic. "I don't know what to do." Jimmy finally realized the gravity of the situation and reminded Jessica that she had an extra bottle of Elysium in her purse. But there was one problem: her purse was in the living room, and Jessica was stuck in the bedroom, transformed into men wearing short pants and undersized pink t-shirt sticking to her rough body. With a surge of desperation, Jessica asked the girls for her bag, trying to fake a girl's voice. "Hey, guys. Can someone please pass me my purse? I need some lip gloss?" The girls looked at each other confused, but one of them got up to fetch the bag. Jessica slowly opened the door halfway, trying not to reveal her partially transformed state. "Thanks, girl," she squeaked, trying to sound feminine while her voice deepened. As she grabbed the bag and rummaged through it, her hands shaking, she finally found the Elysium. She downed it in one gulp, feeling the familiar sensation of her body shifting back to its female form. Jessica felt relieved as the Elysium worked, changing her back to her female form. She tried to laugh it off, saying, "I really needed that lip gloss." But she couldn't shake off the worry that something was wrong with her Elysium doses. And things were about to get even tougher in her relationship. When Jessica started going to parties with friends, Jimmy got jealous. They had a big fight, and Jimmy's eyes showed how much he wanted her attention. Jessica remembered how intense he looked, and it left her breathless. Even with the challenges, Jessica was drawn to Jimmy's passionate side. To make up for his aggressive attitude in the fight, Jimmy took Jessica on a whirlwind trip to Paris, showering her with gifts and affection. Jessica felt like a baby. They lost track of time, missing classes and indulging in each other's love. But as they returned to reality, they knew they had to make up for lost time. That evening, after returning from their trip, Jessica took her usual dose of Elysium, feeling her body settle into its female form as she drifted off to sleep in Jimmy's arms. She wore her short nightgown, expecting to wake up the next day at the right time as Aaron, ready to head to classes. But little did she know, the night had other plans. But in the middle of the night, something unexpected happened. The Elysium's effect began to wear off, and Aaron's male form started to re-emerge, without Jessica even realizing it. She remained fast asleep, oblivious to the transformation taking place within her own body. It wasn't until the next morning, when Aaron's dad arrived unexpectedly, that the truth became shockingly clear. His dad's face turned red with rage, his blood boiled as he took in the scene. He stood there, silent, his anger building. Then, he took a step forward, his eyes fixed on Aaron. Aaron, sensing his dad's fury, slowly stood up, his eyes downcast in shame. And that's when his dad slapped him, hard, across the face. "How could you, Aaron?" his dad thundered, his voice shaking with anger. "You have committed a grave sin. Neither I nor God will ever forgive you for this." Jimmy remained frozen in bed, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him, but he didn't move or speak, not wanting to intervene. Aaron's dad stormed out of the room, leaving Aaron shattered and broken. The slap still stung, but it was nothing compared to the pain of his dad's words. Aaron collapsed to the floor, overcome with emotion. He buried his face in his hands and broke down crying, his body shaking with sobs. Jimmy finally moved, getting out of bed and approaching Aaron cautiously. He put a hand on Aaron's shoulder, but Aaron shook it off, not wanting to be comforted. "Just leave me alone, Jimmy," Aaron sobbed, his voice cracking with pain. "I've lost everything. My dad, my future, it's all gone." Aaron was consumed by shame and guilt. He hadn't eaten or spoken all day. Seeing the Elysium bottles on the table, he smashed them in a fit of rage. Overwhelmed, Aaron wanted to end his life. Suddenly, Aaron ran to the window and opened it. He stood on the edge, the wind blowing his hair. Jimmy was shocked and screamed, "Aaron, no." He grabbed Aaron's arm just in time. Aaron tried to break free, but Jimmy held tight. "It's okay, I'm here," Jimmy said softly. Aaron cried, "I don't want to live like this." Jimmy pulled him back into the room and closed the window. Aaron broke down, sobbing. "I didn't want to come out like this. I hate myself." Jimmy comforted him, "I can't imagine what you're going through, but please don't hurt yourself. You have so much to live for." Aaron lashed out, blaming Jimmy for his situation. "This is all your fault. If I never met you, I wouldn't be like this." Jimmy listened patiently, knowing Aaron wasn't himself. "I'll fix this, I promise," Jimmy said. "Just give me time. You don't have to talk to me if you don't want to." Jimmy called Mark to come and stay with Aaron as he is going somewhere. Mark found it unusual, but he was ready to help his only friends on campus. As Mark arrived, Jimmy left, determined to find a solution. He got in his car, ready to take action and make things right. Back in the present, Jessica was waiting for Jimmy while he attended his important board meeting. Inside, Jimmy stood before the board members, his heart racing like a drum. They looked tough and judgmental, but he was ready. He had to act confident, or they'd tear him apart like vultures. He reminded himself that his brother was gone, but his dream of making the world a better place lived on. With a deep breath, Jimmy began his speech. We should focus on helping those who need it most, he said. Develop products for minority sectors and create low-cost medicines. Some board members laughed, saying, "That's nice, Jimmy, but we need to make money." Then, Mr. Gustavo, a senior executive and researcher, spoke up. He was a highly respected expert in the field and had joined the company a few years ago, quickly rising through the ranks. Jimmy's brother had valued his opinion and considered him a close friend. "Or we could create a game-changing product that generates profits instantly," Gustavo said. The board members leaned in, curious. Jimmy guessed it was Elysium, a secret project his brother had been working on. Gustavo's words gave the board members confidence, but Jimmy felt a pang of doubt. Was Gustavo trying to take control of the company? Gustavo's words gave the board members confidence, but Jimmy felt a pang of doubt. Was Gustavo trying to take control of the company? The board decided to wait, asking both Jimmy and Gustavo to present a solid plan for the company's future. As Jimmy left the meeting room, he let out a sigh of relief. It was intense, but he knew he had to grow up and lead. In the washroom, Gustavo approached him, saying, "Nice speech, Jimmy." Jimmy smiled, but it was fake. Gustavo revealed that he had been friends with Jimmy's brother and was sad about his death. "We were working on something big," he said. Jimmy's curiosity sparked. "Was it Elysium?" he asked. Just then, employees entered the washroom, and Gustavo said, "Let's talk tomorrow, Jimmy. I have something important to share." Jimmy knew it was about Elysium, and he couldn't wait to find out. Dropping Jessica off at her apartment had become a routine for Jimmy. The old building seemed to sag under the weight of time, and Jimmy's heart went out to her every time he saw it. He tried to offer her money, but she'd refused, asking only for a bundle of Elysium. Jimmy wondered if he was pressuring her somehow, and the thought made him uneasy. As Jessica exited the Rolls-Royce, she waved, "Goodbye," with a cute smile. Jimmy watched her disappear into the building, his mind racing. He hoped she could stay at his house, even as Aaron, until she found a job. Maybe he could offer her a position at his company, but he remembered her offended side and didn't want to risk another slap. Just then, Jimmy's phone rang. Jessica's voice was on the other end, trembling. "Jimmy, my landlord locked me out for not paying rent. Can I stay at your place?" Jimmy's heart skipped a beat. He pulled the car back up and picked Jessica up. During the ride to his place, Jessica seemed upset, her eyes fixed on the floor. Jimmy kept quiet, not wanting to make the situation awkward. The tension was palpable, but Jimmy was happy to have her near, even in these dark times. Her presence was a comforting solace, and he was determined to support her. Back at Jimmy's penthouse, Jessica had transformed back into Aaron and changed into one of Jimmy's outfits, a white tank top and cargo shorts. The clothes fit him perfectly. He started cooking dinner, his hands moving with a confident flair. Jimmy sat at the kitchen table, watching with a smile. "I'll make the best meal you've ever had, man," Aaron said, grinning. Jimmy joked, "Hope it's not the burned noodles from college." Aaron playfully replied, "What did you know? There wasn't much in the fridge. I was going to make my signature chicken tarragon." As they chatted, Jimmy felt a sense of joy he hadn't felt in weeks. Since the funeral, he'd been lonely, avoiding interactions with others. But with Aaron by his side, he felt alive again. During dinner, Jimmy talked about Mr. Gustavo. "He seems suspicious and knows about Elysium," Jimmy said. "I need to visit him and find out what he wants." Aaron listened and felt happy that Jimmy was thinking about work, not just his sadness. It was good for Jimmy to focus on other things. After dinner, Jimmy showed Aaron to the guest room, but before leaving, Aaron asked for a bottle of Elysium. Jimmy handed over the Elysium, his eyes filled with concern. "Aaron, maybe it's time to take a break from taking this," he said gently. "I feel like I'm pushing you to use it too much." But before Jimmy could say another word, Aaron's finger gently touched his lips, silencing him. It was a subtle gesture, yet it held a deep intensity. For a fleeting moment, Jimmy felt a shiver run down his spine as he sensed Jessica's presence, as if she had momentarily taken control of Aaron's body. The air was charged with an unspoken understanding, leaving Jimmy wondering what lay beneath Aaron's enigmatic smile. Aaron locked the door behind him, leaving Jimmy wondering what would happen next. The silence between them was palpable, filled with unspoken emotions and desires. Jimmy's heart beat faster, anticipating what Aaron, or was it Jessica, had in store for him. Jimmy gazed at the blank roof in his dimly lit room, lost in thought. Had Jessica fallen for him again? He quickly brushed off the idea, thinking she was just being kind to help him cope with his grief. She'd eventually leave to be with Emily, and he'd be alone once more. Jimmy's mind wandered to the past, to the day he'd left their hostel room without a word. He'd seen Aaron's desperate attempt to end his life and knew he had to act fast. Jimmy had driven for 6 hours to Aaron's father's house, his heart heavy with worry. As he arrived in the quiet countryside town, Jimmy took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Mr. Connor answered, his face twisted in anger. "You're that roommate, aren't you? How dare you show your face here?" Jimmy stood firm, despite the hostility. "I need to talk to you, sir. It's about Aaron." Mr. Connor's rage boiled over, and he shouted, "Get off my property, son, before I call the cops." But Jimmy refused to back down. "Aaron tried to kill himself today," he said, his voice steady. Mr. Connor's expression faltered, and for a moment, Jimmy saw a glimmer of concern. "Where is he now?" he asked gruffly. Jimmy replied, "He's all right, sir. I told him I'd talk to you." Mr. Connor sighed, his anger slowly dissipating, and gestured for Jimmy to enter. Jimmy stood tall, despite his trembling heart. He had rehearsed this confrontation in his mind during the long drive, but nothing could prepare him for the raw emotion that awaited him. Mrs. Connor served Aaron a soothing tea, her eyes filled with concern. "I always knew everything about my son," she said, her voice laced with a deep love. "I knew he was struggling, and I wanted to help." Jimmy thanked her, his voice barely above a whisper. The tension in the room was palpable as Mr. Connor's anger simmered just below the surface. "Aaron is all right, isn't he?" Mrs. Connor asked, her voice trembling. Jimmy nodded. "Yes, he's okay. A friend is taking care of him." Mr. Connor's face darkened. "You're the one who's been encouraging this. He spat out the words. "My son, dressing like a woman, sleeping with boys, you're the one who's ruined him." Mrs. Connor's gentle touch on her husband's arm stayed his rage. "Just listen, dear. Maybe Jimmy knows more than we do." Jimmy took a deep breath. "Sir, Aaron wants to see you happy, but he's been hiding a part of himself. He's miserable when he's not true to himself. He wants your acceptance." Mr. Connor's expression twisted in disgust. "Here we go again." But Jimmy continued, his voice steady. "He told me he wants to be free, to be himself without fear. He's been suppressing his true self his whole life, and it's making him miserable." Mrs. Connor's eyes locked onto Jimmy's, her voice filled with a mix of sadness and understanding. "He had always been like that, Jimmy. He never made much friends in high school, and always kept to himself." Mr. Connor's voice rose, his anger boiling over. "And playing with those dolls, and wearing dresses that you gave him. Now look at what he's doing in the city." "Please, stop saying these things," Mrs. Connor said, her voice rising. "I know my son, and if being like that makes him happy, then I'll support him." Mr. Connor looked down, his face hidden. Mrs. Connor continued, her voice filled with emotion. Yes, I've always known Aaron wanted to be a woman. When he was young, he'd talk about being a princess and ask for girls' toys. I bought them for him, even though I was confused. But I learned about being trans and accepted my little girl. Her eyes locked onto Jimmy's. But his father didn't. He scolded Aaron until my child became a shell of themselves. Mrs. Connor took a step closer to Jimmy, a soft smile on her face. You know, Jimmy, when Aaron was a teenager, he'd secretly wear my clothes. He looked so happy, so free. I always knew, but I didn't want to stop him. I saw the spark in his eyes, the smile on his face. Jimmy smiled back, his eyes shining. Yes, I've seen that spark too. He's truly happy when he's himself. Mrs. Connor's voice dropped to a whisper. I remember taking Aaron's father away for a few days and leaving a new dress for Aaron in my room. When I returned, he was beaming with joy. And later, a neighbor told me about a new girl in town, wearing that very dress. They said she was the most beautiful girl in town. Her eyes sparkled with memories. My son, my beautiful daughter, deserves to be happy. And I'll always be here to support him. Mrs. Connor's face lit up with a warm smile as she remembered her son's childhood. Jimmy, does Aaron love you? She asked, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Aaron nodded, a soft smile spreading across his face. Yes, Mrs. Connor, I think so, he replied, his voice filled with happiness. He pulled out his phone to show pictures of him and Jessica, but Mr. Connor interrupted, his voice firm and authoritative. That's enough, he said, standing up and facing Jimmy. I don't want my son to end up unhappy and without a proper career or partner. Mrs. Connor's face turned red with anger. And how you used to torment that poor child to be a man, she exclaimed. You forced him to do things he didn't want to do, and because of you, he became a shell of himself. Now you're worried about him being unhappy, she asked, her voice filled with emotion. Mr. Connor fell silent, his face pale and expressionless. Mrs. Connor continued, her voice steady. Son, you were about to show us some pictures, she said. He took out his phone and showed Mrs. Connor pictures of him and Jessica, their romantic Paris trip, and Jessica smiling with friends. Mrs. Connor's eyes lit up as she swiped through the photos, her face filled with wonder. Is that my daughter? Is that my Aaron? She asked, her voice filled with awe. She's so beautiful, how is this possible? She whispered, her eyes fixed on the photos. Jimmy explained the miracle drug and its potential to change transgender lives forever. He spoke of its safety and effectiveness, and how it could give Aaron the chance to live as his true self. Mr. Connor peeked at the pictures secretly, his face a mix of shock and amazement. How is this possible? Is that Aaron? He whispered, his voice barely audible. Both parents took some time to adjust to the new reality of their son's life. Mrs. Connor's excitement grew as she realized her son could finally be his authentic self. See, God allowed this drug to exist. If it was a sin, he wouldn't have allowed it, she said, her voice filled with conviction. Mr. Connor walked away to another room, leaving Mrs. Connor and Jimmy alone. Mrs. Connor turned to Jimmy and asked him to stay for the night. Don't worry, Mr. Connor won't do anything, she said, her eyes filled with determination. The evening passed quickly. Jimmy went to Aaron's room, which was typical of a boy's room, similar to his own. He sat there, trying to imagine how Aaron must have felt coming back to this room every day. He spotted a vision board on Aaron's cupboard, with worn-out pictures of Paris, Audrey Hepburn, and a couple kissing. Aaron's dreams and desires were evident, and Jimmy felt a deep connection to him. Mrs. Connor invited Jimmy to dinner at the main table. Jimmy was a bit afraid, expecting an awkward meal. And it was. Mr. Connor didn't utter a word or look at him throughout dinner. Mrs. Connor tried to make Jimmy comfortable, filling the silence with conversation. As dinner ended, Mrs. Connor said, "Jimmy, I think I'll call Aaron and tell him everything's fine here. We still love him." Aaron's face lit up with happiness. This was what Jimmy had come for, to give Aaron the freedom and realization that the people who loved him would always be behind him, no matter who he was. But Mr. Connor interrupted, his voice firm. "Could you give this boy and me a moment, honey?" Jimmy felt a surge of fear. Maybe Mr. Connor had reached his peak, and his anger would finally boil over. Jimmy's heart racing, he wondered if Mr. Connor would pull out a gun and shoot him. But fortunately Mr. Connor invited Jimmy to the porch, offering him a cigar. The wine from dinner had seemingly calmed him down. They sat on the wooden sofa, surrounded by the serene beauty of the night sky. "This land was my father's," Mr. Connor said, his voice filled with emotion. "He worked hard to buy it. I grew up under his tough watch, son. Those beatings. I was angry, but later I realized he was trying to make me tough, to prepare me for this cruel world." Tears began to roll down Mr. Connor's face as he spoke. "I tried to be less of my father with Aaron, to give him everything, a good education, morals. But the only love I could muster for my son was my tough love." Jimmy listened intently, his heart going out to Mr. Connor. "I understand," he said softly. Mr. Connor's eyes locked onto Jimmy's. "Maybe if I would have seen he required something else from me, instead of tough love. Maybe he would have turned out differently. I think it wasn't your fault, but he tried hard to be the person you want him to be, sir," Jimmy said gently. "But I guess God doesn't create everybody equal, but that doesn't mean they aren't special in their own way." Mr. Connor's face contorted in worry. "But what would this specialness take him to? He won't be accepted in this cruel world. I fear he'll end up poor, rejected, and I won't be there for my son when he needs me." Jimmy's voice was filled with conviction. "He will, sir. He'll have a great life. He's smart, and you've helped him become the person he is today. But, now you might want to give him a chance to find himself, to figure out who he wants to be for the rest of his life, without your expectations." Mr. Connor nodded slowly. "Okay." Jimmy continued, "What?" "Okay, if he felt that his old man is giving him pressure with his expectations, I will release Aaron from it." Jimmy's heart swelled with gratitude. "But you gotta promise me one thing, son," Mr. Connor said. "Yes, sir," Jimmy replied. "Don't force that drug of yours on him. Let him figure out on his own whether he wants to be a woman or a man." Jimmy felt sad. Mr. Connor didn't fully understand yet, but he knew it wasn't the right time to explain. Maybe with time, Mr. Connor would start to understand and accept the truth. Mr. Connor called his wife to the porch and asked her to call Aaron. "Tell him I'm not angry anymore," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Despite the late hour, Aaron picked up, and Mrs. Connor spoke to him, her voice gentle and reassuring. Aaron tried not to cry when he answered the call. He thought his parents had rejected him. "Aaron, honey, are you okay?" his mom asked. "Yes, I'm okay, Mama. Listen, everything is all right, son. We love you, and your father loves you," she said. "No, he doesn't. He hates me," Aaron replied. His mom said, "He asked me to tell you he's not angry, and he wants you to focus on your studies." Aaron was surprised and asked if his father really said that. His mom confirmed it, and Aaron felt relieved. Jimmy watched from the porch, feeling that this was a good start, even if it wasn't a perfect acceptance like in the movies. As Jimmy drove away the next day, he couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Connor's reaction. Would he fully accept Jessica as her daughter, or would he stay in denial? Maybe Mr. Connor just needed time to come to terms with the situation. Jimmy found it beautiful that at least Mr. Connor was trying to understand his son, even if it was hard for him. He hoped that one day, Mr. Connor would fully love and accept his son for who he truly was. After arriving in college hostel that evening, Jimmy entered his room, and Jessica's gentle gaze met his. She was calm, yet her eyes sparkled with a mix of emotions. Jimmy was confused. Why had Aaron transformed back into Jessica? Jessica approached Jimmy, her voice soft. "I heard what you did." Suddenly, she slapped Jimmy, making him jump back in surprise. Jimmy was scared now. He might have overstepped some boundaries, but he did that for Jessica. "I'm sorry, I thought if I..." He apologized, but Jessica's next move caught him off guard. She grabbed his head and kissed him deeply, their lips tangled in a passionate embrace. Both struggled to breathe as they indulged in each other, like two souls lost in the moment. As they broke apart, gasping for air, Jessica said, "Aaron, I need to talk to you." She led Jimmy to the bed, her eyes brimming with tears. "What you did was helpful," she said, her voice trembling. "Knowing my father still loves me gives me peace. But you crossed a line, Jimmy. I need time to figure myself out." Jimmy's heart ached as Jessica continued, "I need to go back to being Aaron and understand myself." Jimmy's panic grew. "You want a breakup?" Jessica's response was gentle but firm. "I just need time, Jimmy. Time to find myself." Jimmy remembered Mr. Connor's words about giving his son a chance to figure out. With a heavy heart, he said, "Okay, take all the time you need. I'll be waiting." The next day, Jimmy packed his belongings, his eyes locked on Aaron's, both trying to hide their tears. Their awkward handshake was a goodbye, and Jimmy's whispered words were a promise, "I'll wait for you." As Jimmy drove away, tears streamed down his face, but he held on to the hope that Jessica would return when she missed him. Months went by, and Jimmy saw Aaron less often. When he did, Sophia was usually with him. Jimmy wondered if Aaron was avoiding him. He still hoped to catch a glimpse of Aaron in the hallways, but it didn't happen. One day, Jimmy saw Aaron kissing a girl in an empty classroom. His heart shattered into pieces. He thought Aaron was trying to make him jealous, but they started appearing together everywhere. Jimmy tried to escape the pain by focusing on his studies and internship. He helped out in the lab, where he ran into Sophia. Jimmy asked about Aaron, and Sophia's face turned pale. "Aaron, I know you loved Jessica," Sophia said. Jimmy smiled, thinking maybe Jessica missed him. But Sophia's next words crushed him. "Aaron has found someone else, Emily. He's in love with her." Jimmy felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He couldn't breathe. Sophia hugged him as he broke down in tears. "Jessica wants you to move on, graduate, and be successful. She's happy now with someone else." Jimmy asked, "Will she ever come back?" "She promised me she would." Sophia replied, "I don't know, Jimmy. Aaron's happy with Emily now. Maybe you should move on." Jimmy thought, "How can I?" But with time, he slowly healed. He worked on himself more and more. He thought he'd forgotten Jessica, but the memories lingered. As Jimmy moved on, he realized a part of him would always love Jessica. The memories of their time together remained, a bittersweet reminder of what could have been. Though he tried to erase the pain, it remained, a constant ache he learned to live with. Tears began to roll down Jimmy's face as his mind wandered back to his room. He had thought he lost Jessica forever. But now, life was giving him another chance, and Jessica a chance to decide. Just then, Jessica's soft voice filled the room. "Hey." Jimmy was about to fall asleep when he heard her. She stood by the door, wearing a wet tank top and brown cargo shorts that looked too big for her. Jessica approached Jimmy's bed, her eyes shining with a gentle request. "Can I sleep with you tonight?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jimmy's heart skipped a beat as he nodded, unsure of what to say. Jessica climbed onto the bed, her movements fluid and effortless. "Undress me," she whispered, her words sending a shiver down Jimmy's spine. He hesitated for a moment before gently removing her tank top, revealing her bare shoulders. "You forgot something, mister," Jessica teased, her eyes sparkling with amusement. Jimmy's face flushed as he slowly pulled down her cargo shorts, his hands trembling slightly. As they kissed, Jimmy felt a deep connection to Jessica, a sense of love and tenderness that he had never experienced before. Jessica's hand wandered inside his shirt, tracing the contours of his chest, and Jimmy's heart swelled with emotion. Next, Jessica took Jimmy's hand and guided it to her side, her touch sending a warm sensation through his body. Jimmy felt a sense of wonder and awe, his heart overflowing with love for this beautiful woman. As they moved together, Jimmy felt a deep sense of connection, a sense of oneness that he had never felt before. It was as if their bodies were meant to be together, moving in perfect harmony. In this moment, Jimmy knew that he loved Jessica so deeply, and he was grateful for this chance to be with her after all these years. He felt a sense of peace and contentment wash over him, and he knew that everything was going to be okay. The next morning, Jimmy's phone rang, waking him up. They had slept late, wrapped in each other's arms, and Jimmy felt like he was in heaven. He gazed into her eyes, sparkling like diamonds in the morning light, and kissed her forehead. Jimmy's phone rang, waking him up. He answered, and Mr. Gustavo asked him to come to the lab where he and Aaron used to work in college. Jimmy wasn't surprised, knowing that Elysium's research was still going on. He gently kissed Jessica's forehead, not wanting to wake her. "I have to go," he whispered. Jessica stirred and smiled. "I'll cook lunch for you," she said. "My special chicken tarragon." Jimmy smiled and got out of bed. He got ready and left for the lab. He wondered what Mr. Gustavo wanted to talk about. At the lab, Mr. Gustavo was waiting. They said hello, and Gustavo took Jimmy to a room he had visited years ago, where he first discovered the special Elysium drug. Now, he was back here again. As they walked, Gustavo asked, "You know about Elysium, right?" Jimmy nodded, yes. Gustavo smiled. "Well, you'll be surprised by the new Elysium." They entered a room with a big refrigerator. Gustavo opened it and took out a blue bottle. Gustavo said, "Jimmy, this is the new Elysium, the advanced one." Jimmy was curious again. "What does that mean?" he asked Gustavo. Gustavo explained, "We made its effect permanent, Jimmy. This Elysium is the only product in the world that can change gender and body forever. Just think about what we can do with it, and how far we can go." Jimmy was amazed. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Jessica was shopping at the supermarket when she saw her old friend Sophia. Sophia was with a guy who looked a bit rough, like a hillbilly, but he was young and kind of handsome. Sophia was excited to see Jessica and ran over to her. "It's been so long. I have so much to tell you." Jessica was excited too. "Do you have time?" she asked. Sophia nodded and ran back to her guy. She kissed him and said, "I'll meet you later." He walked outside, and Sophia turned back to Jessica. The two friends found a table at a nearby coffee shop and sat down. Jessica felt happy to be with Sophia, who had been a great friend during college. Most of the time, Jessica had hung out with Sophia as Mark, her male alter ego. Sophia had understood Jessica's inner struggles and had been a good listener. Now, as they sat together as women, Jessica was curious about Sophia's handsome companion. "Who's the guy?" she asked. Sophia smiled and showed Jessica her engagement ring. "He's my fiancé." Jessica was surprised but happy for her friend. "That's amazing," she said. Then Sophia shared even more shocking news: she was pregnant. Jessica's eyes widened in shock. How is that possible, she wondered. Wouldn't the effects of Elysium reverse eventually? Sophia realized Jessica didn't know about the new Elysium. It's permanent now, she explained. Elysium changes a man into a woman forever. Jessica's eyes widened in shock as Sophia revealed the new Elysium's permanent effects. She felt like she had been punched in the gut, her mind reeling with the implications. Permanent, she thought, her brain struggling to process the news. As the shock began to wear off, curiosity and excitement crept in. Jessica's mind started racing with possibilities. I could live as a woman fully, without worrying about reverting back, she thought. I could have a family, be a mother. Her eyes drifted to Sophia's belly, and she felt a pang of excitement. This could be me someday, she thought, a thrill running through her veins. She was surprised Jimmy hadn't told her about the new Elysium, but maybe he didn't want to force her into anything. That sounded like him. Jessica asked Sophia about Regina, who had disappeared years ago. Jimmy and the authorities were still trying to find her. But Sophia's expression turned angry. Regina is a snake, she said. She had no good intentions for the company or anyone else. She even used the drug on herself to turn into a man. Sophia had worked for Regina and had slowly realized her true intentions. Jessica listened, shocked by the revelation. Jessica's breath stopped. She thought, could it be? She told Sophia about Gustavo and how he looks, trying to confirm her concern that Regina might be Gustavo. Sophia nodded. Yes, that's Regina's male form. I'm sure of it. Jessica understood everything. Mr. Gustavo is Regina, she thought. He wants to take over the company and use Elysium for bad things. She felt scared. He killed Jimmy's brother, she thought. I must tell him the truth. He's in danger. Jessica quickly called Jimmy's phone. She had to warn him about Mr. Gustavo. Her heart was racing. She waited for Jimmy to answer. Back in the lab, Jimmy was amazed by the new version of Elysium. Jimmy said, Mr. Gustavo, I've always wondered if we could make possible to use Elysium to help trans people and those with gender dysphoria. Mr. Gustavo smiled, but his face looked cruel. You're thinking too small, kid. This thing is too valuable. I used to think like you, but now I see its true power. Jimmy was confused. His phone vibrated, but he ignored it to listen to Mr. Gustavo. I've found people willing to pay hundreds of millions for a single dose, Mr. Gustavo said. Imagine the money we can make if we deliver it to them exclusively. Jimmy's eyes widened. What people are you talking about? And what will they do with Elysium? Mr. Gustavo shrugged. Powerful people, Jimmy. It's none of our business. They just want us to deliver. Jimmy was horrified. That's crazy. It'll end up on the black market and cause chaos. Mr. Gustavo sneered. You don't make money by being kind, Jimmy. Jimmy's phone rang again. This time, he answered. Jessica's panicked voice was on the other end. Jimmy, it's Regina, she's Gustavo, she changed into a man, she killed your brother, get out of there. Jimmy's world froze. He heard his own breathing, and suddenly, he understood. He was being played. Without flinching, he clenched his fists and punched Mr. Gustavo in the stomach with all his might. Mr. Gustavo fell to the ground. You psycho! Jimmy shouted. I don't usually strike a woman, but I can make an exception with you since you're a man now, Gustavo sneered, his eyes blazing with anger. Realizing his plan was unraveling, Gustavo's face twisted in desperation. He pulled out a gun, pointing it straight at Jimmy's head. You and your brother are both the same, you don't understand the amount of money you can make, he spat, his voice venomous. Jimmy backed away, fear gripping his heart. It's not about money, Gustavo. We want to help people, he said, trying to reason with him. Gustavo gave a silent, mocking laugh. If that was easy, your fucking idiot brother also thought that. Look what it got him, he sneered, his gun still trained on Jimmy. Jimmy's anger boiled over, and he wanted to reach out and grab the barrel, trying to throw away the gun and punch Gustavo's face, even if it meant getting killed. He thought, there's no one left in this world for me anyway, my parents are gone, and my brother is dead. Maybe getting killed is the only option. But then, flashes of Jessica's face came into his mind, her smile, their joking conversations about their possible future together in college. She was the only one left that he cared about. Tears started rolling down his eyes slowly.
Bye.
Jimmy, Gustavo whispered, his finger tightening on the trigger. Just as Gustavo was about to fire, a loud voice echoed through the lab, drop your gun and get on the ground. Multiple officers burst in, surrounding Gustavo. Police. You're under arrest. Gustavo's face twisted in rage as he was taken down. Jimmy collapsed, relief washing over him. Jessica must have called the police. He thought, I have to see her, to hold her. Jimmy met Jessica outside. She was with Sophia, and her face lit up with a big smile as she ran to him and hugged him tightly. I thought you were going to die, Jessica cried, her voice shaking. I really thought that. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. Jimmy smiled, holding her close. I'm here, I'm safe, he whispered, his own voice filled with emotion. Jimmy's heart swelled with love. Jessica's grip on him tightened. Please don't ever let me go, she begged, her voice cracking with emotion. Jessica realized how deeply she loved Jimmy, and how far they both go to save each other. She couldn't lie to herself anymore now she was all in, and she knew Jimmy felt the same way. As the truth came out, Gustavo confessed to his crimes, including sabotaging the plane that Jimmy's brother was in. He was sentenced to prison for a long time, bringing closure to Jimmy. Jimmy presented his new plan to the board members, using Elysium to help people while still making a profit. He explained how they could make it accessible to those who needed it most, and how it could change lives. The board members were impressed, and he was appointed as the new CEO. 3 years later, a reporter stood at the Transcare launch event, smiling at the camera. We're here at Transcare's new opening, the world's leading transgender care center. Mr. Jimmy's company has changed lives, and it's an amazing story. The reporter approached Jimmy and Jessica, who were holding hands. Jessica's arm was nestled in Jimmy's elbow, a symbol of their love. Mr. Jimmy, you're a hero to many. How does it feel to be a powerful CEO, changing trans people's lives? The reporter asked. Jimmy's eyes sparkled. I couldn't have done it without my brother's legacy and Jessica's help. The reporter turned to Jessica. And how does it feel to be dating someone so amazing? Jessica looked at Jimmy, seeking his permission. Then, with a radiant smile, she said, actually, I'm his wife now. She proudly showed off her wedding ring. Jimmy and Jessica shared a tender kiss, announcing their marriage to the world. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. As they hugged, Jimmy whispered, I love you. I love you too, Jessica replied, her eyes shining with happiness. Thank you for listening to this story. Please let me know what do you think about it and don't forget to subscribe to never miss out on new stories like this.